I recently relocated to Iowa, seeking a quiet escape from my past. I landed a decent job, and the peaceful rural setting, though unfamiliar, has grown on me. 6 months ago, I found a small, affordable house on a surprisingly large property. The highlight was the massive cornfield bordering my backyard, separated only by a flimsy wooden fence. It was almost as if the field encroached upon the house. The isolation was peaceful. I often found myself gazing out at the cornfield, lost in thought. However, a chilling incident shattered the tranquility. On a cold October night, I was outside enjoying the wind when a piercing scream cut through the silence. It wasn't an animal cry, it was a child's desperate plea for help. A chilling scream pierced the silence, emanating from the cornfield. Without hesitation, I grabbed my hunting rifle and rushed towards the source of the sound. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I called out, urging the child to respond. The silence was deafening. I jumped the fence and ventured into the cornfield, the dim light of my phone illuminating the path. I yelled out, but there was no answer. Realizing I was out of my depth, I called the police, explaining the situation. When they arrived, I insisted on joining the search. We combed through the field for hours, calling out, but there was no sign of the child. No footprints, no disturbance, no trace of their presence. It was as if the scream had never happened. We eventually gave up, the officers advising me to call if I heard anything else. Frustrated, I couldn't shake the feeling that it might have been a prank. While I understood the boredom that could drive such a cruel joke, it still sickened me. As I prepared for bed, a horrifying sight caught my eye, a faint orange glow emanating from the cornfield. A fire, small but growing, was spreading rapidly in the windy night. Panic surged through me. Grabbing a hose, I raced towards the fire, drenched myself, and began to fight the flames. I knew the fire department would take time to arrive, leaving me as the only line of defense. With focused determination, I fought the flames, miraculously containing the fire before it could spread further. As I caught my breath, a movement at the upstairs window caught my eye. A figure was inside my bedroom. Panic surged through me. I dropped the hose and rushed into the house, the chaotic scene inside confirming my worst fears. The kitchen was ransacked, the fridge and cabinets open, dishes shattered on the floor. I was stunned, unable to comprehend what had happened. I barely registered the chaos before the front door slammed shut. I raced towards it, but the intruder was gone. Outside, there was no sign of them. Exhausted and overwhelmed, I waited for the police and firefighters to arrive. They took the attempted arson seriously, deploying additional officers and dogs to search the area. However, there was no trace of the intruder. For weeks, I lived in fear, every sound triggering a wave of anxiety. I slept with my rifle by my side, haunted by the thought of a child in distress. The mystery of the scream and the fire remains unsolved, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the quiet countryside. Growing up in rural Nebraska, I'd bike to school daily, a necessary routine due to my parents' busy work schedules. Our home was nestled amidst vast farmland, with a massive cornfield dominating the landscape. It seemed endless, especially to a child's eyes. My parents always warned me against cutting through the field, fearing I'd get lost without a phone. I respected their concern, having witnessed how disorienting the corn maze could be. So every day, I'd take the longer route along the main road. Despite the solitude, I grew fond of these bike rides. The quiet countryside and the rhythmic pedaling became a source of comfort. One weekday, as I was cycling home, disaster struck. My bike chain snapped, leaving me stranded and perplexed. My dad had taught me basic bike repair, but this problem proved too complex. I was alone, miles from home, and my trusty steed was rendered useless. I was stranded. The thought of walking home with a broken bike was dreadful. Without a phone, I couldn't call my parents for help. Asking a stranger for a ride wasn't an option. I knew better. I was on my own. The usual route home was a long one. Desperate for a shortcut, I glanced at the cornfield. It was against my parents' rules, but the temptation to save time was too strong. I reasoned that walking straight through the field couldn't be too difficult. With a mix of determination and recklessness, I pushed my bike into the towering cornstalks. At first, the path was clear. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy. But as I ventured deeper, the feeling of unease grew. The silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional rustle. I found myself glancing behind me, a sense of fear creeping in. Then, a faint rustling sound caught my attention. It was coming from the corn, just off the path. I paused, straining to hear the sound. It couldn't be the wind, it was too deliberate. The rustling stopped, but as soon as I moved, it started again, louder and closer. Panic set in. Was it an animal? But what kind of animal would make that noise? I quickened my pace, desperate to escape the eerie cornfield. I couldn't abandon my bike, but every step I took, the rustling seemed to follow. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the fear was overwhelming. Finally, the noise ceased. I breathed a sigh of relief, but my caution remained. At the next intersection, I veered off the path, hoping to avoid any potential danger. As I rounded the corner, I froze. A man stood in the middle of the path, his gaze fixed on me. He was a stranger, his clothes dirty and torn, his arms marked with long, strange scratches. His voice, low and raspy, asked if I was lost. Terror consumed me. I couldn't move, trapped in a nightmare. He took a step forward, offering to guide me home. My instinct screamed to run, but I was paralyzed. As he advanced, I finally snapped out of it. Dropping my bike, I sprinted through the cornfield, the man's shouts echoing behind me. I dodged through the stalks, fear fueling my every movement. The rustling of the corn and the man's pursuit created a terrifying symphony. I huddled, trying to make myself as small as possible. I was certain I was going to die. The man, clutching a rope, muttered to himself, "I'll find him." Those words would haunt me forever. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously emerged from the cornfield. My body was shaking uncontrollably. It was dark, and I struggled to walk home. My parents were frantic, relieved to see me safe, but terrified by my ordeal. I recounted the terrifying encounter, leaving my parents heartbroken and furious. Days later, an unexpected event forced us to leave. My old bike, the one I'd abandoned in the cornfield, appeared on our porch. The shock and fear were palpable. My parents, unable to ignore the unsettling incident, made the decision to move. To this day, the memory of that day lingers. My parents rarely speak of it, but the experience has left an indelible mark on my life. I was 28, a failed author returning to my family's farm. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned, but my aging parents needed help. The farm was secluded, surrounded by endless cornfields. The nearest neighbor, an elderly widow, lived a short walk away. Initially, the quiet pace was refreshing. I had plenty of time to think and write, my nocturnal creativity thriving in the solitude. I'd finish the day's chores early, then retreat to my computer, lost in the world of words. I preferred the solitude of the third-floor bedroom, a quiet retreat where my odd sleep schedule wouldn't disturb my parents. The window offered a serene view of the farm, a perfect muse for my nightly writing sessions. However, a peculiar sight began to disrupt the peaceful ambience. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a figure would appear at the edge of the cornfield. At first, I dismissed it as a neighbor tending to their crops, but the figure remained motionless, more like a scarecrow than a living person. I couldn't discern its gender or even if it was facing me. Intrigued by the mystery, I observed the figure more closely. It moved, confirming that it was a person. While unsettling, I convinced myself it was harmless, a strange quirk of rural life. I considered whether it could be the elderly neighbor my mother often mentioned. Perhaps she had a reason for being near the property. After all, an old woman couldn't pose much of a threat. In hindsight, my nonchalance was foolish. Over the next few days, the figure in the cornfield grew bolder. Each night it moved closer to the house, always silent and still. While I couldn't discern any details, it was clear that someone or something was deliberately encroaching on our property. It was time to act. The next morning, I shared my observations with my parents. My mother dismissed it, attributing the figure to the neighbor's odd son. While she was being kind, I knew there was more to it. My parents seemed unconcerned, suggesting I ignore the figure. One evening, as I worked late in the barn, I noticed the figure had moved closer to the property line. A chill ran down my spine. Gathering my courage, I approached the figure, calling out, "Who's there?" But as I drew near, it vanished into the cornfield. My heart raced as I scanned the field, realizing the futility of searching for the mysterious intruder. I was genuinely frightened. Even if it was a troubled kid, I didn't want him on our property. The next morning, I visited the old woman, bluntly asking about the figure. She was baffled, explaining that her health prevented her from going outside at night. Her son had left years ago, and she hadn't seen him in a long time. Realization dawned on me: the figure wasn't the neighbor's son. It was a stranger. I shared this unsettling news with my parents, who became concerned. My mother suggested calling the police, but my father was hesitant. He instructed me to stay awake and alert, ready to wake him if the figure returned. For the next few days, the figure remained absent. Perhaps they'd noticed my confrontation or simply decided to leave. Relief washed over me as the days passed without incident. However, my peace was soon shattered. While finishing chores in the barn, the entire farm plunged into darkness. A power outage, sudden and ominous. Grabbing a flashlight, I rushed out of the barn, drawn by a faint, rustling sound from the cornfield. A figure emerged from the shadows, a bald man in overalls, his gaze fixed on me. He held a rusty garden tool, his expression menacing. Fear consumed me as I fled into the cornfield, the man in hot pursuit. I dove into a row of corn, my heart pounding, hoping to evade his grasp. A few terrifying moments later, I saw the man run past my hiding spot. I yearned to call the police, but fear held me back. After calming down, I emerged from the cornfield and rushed back to the dark house. I called the police and woke my parents. The police searched the property but found nothing. However, they did discover the cause of the outage. Someone had intentionally flooded the breaker box. The next day, we implemented additional security measures and warned our neighbor. With my departure looming, I couldn't leave my parents alone with the lurking threat. We hired a farmhand to assist them, easing my concerns. This bizarre and unsettling experience continues to haunt me, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the quiet countryside.